In medieval Europe, owing even a single coin could destroy you. Debt wasn't just a number in a ledger, it was a crime. And punishment didn't end when you lost your money. It began when you lost your freedom. Public shame was the first strike. Imagine your name nailed to a post, your body locked in stocks while neighbors spit, laugh, and curse your family name. In that moment, you weren't poor, you were condemned. Then came the prisons, dark, suffocating rooms where debtors rotted beside thieves and killers. You could be chained for years, starving in filth, unless your family brought food. And if they couldn't? You died hungry and still in debt. But the worst punishment wasn't the stocks or the prison. It was what happened to your family, because in medieval Europe, debts were inherited. If you couldn't pay, your children would. And that was only the beginning. It always began with desperation, a failed harvest, a sick child, a broken tool. You'd step into the moneylender's chamber with trembling hands, pawning what little you had, grain, land, or even your freedom for a handful of coins. The ink dried, the seal stamped, and with it, your soul was bound. Medieval contracts weren't flexible. They were iron cages of law crafted so that one missed payment meant ruin. And once the bailiff had your name on parchment, he had your life. Miss a payment, and you didn't just lose money, you lost anonymity. Guards would drag you from your bed, neighbors whispering as though you'd committed treason. In their eyes, debt wasn't misfortune, it was sin. The courtrooms were swift and merciless. Debt trials lasted minutes. You'd kneel in chains, the judge barely glancing at your pleas. And the verdict? Always the same, guilty of owing more than you could pay. Then came the cages, a debtor's cart rolling through the streets, your shame paraded for all to see. Children threw mud, old men spat. And as the wheels clattered, your reputation shattered forever. But worse than the cage was the cell it carried you to. Debtors' prisons weren't built for life. They were built for decay. You entered whole, you left a husk, if you left at all. No light, no air, no freedom. Only walls that dripped with the sweat of the damned. Food? That wasn't provided. You survived only if family or strangers brought scraps through the bars. If no one came, starvation was your executioner. Some prisoners sold their clothes for bread, trading warmth for one more day alive. Meanwhile, outside, your family was stripped bare. Bailiffs seized tools, animals, even cradles from your children's beds. Your household wasn't just poor. It was dismantled piece by piece, until nothing remained but grief. And the worst cruelty? Debt didn't die with you. Your wife inherited it. Your children carried it. Generations chained to a number in a ledger. What began as hunger for one man became hunger for an entire bloodline. Some towns branded debtors with the mark of shame. A single letter burned into flesh, announcing to the world that you were untrustworthy, tainted, untouchable. A mark that never healed, even if the debt was paid. But branding wasn't the end. In some places, debtors vanished entirely. In certain kingdoms, the punishment escalated beyond shame. Chronic debtors were marched to the edge of town, condemned like criminals. Some faced gallows. Others were sent to labor camps where exhaustion killed more surely than rope. And exile was another fate. You could be loaded onto ships, sent in chains to foreign lands as forced labor. Your debt repaid not with coin, but with your life. For others, the sentence was lifelong servitude, working in monasteries, castles, or fields. Laboring not for wages, but simply to chip away at the number in a book. Yet, no matter how hard you worked, the debt always seemed to grow. Families of debtors often descended into begging. Once proud households reduced to shadows, kneeling in churchyards for crumbs, ignored by the same institution that had condemned their husbands, fathers and sons. Even death offered no release. Many debtors were denied burial rights, dumped in shallow graves without markers, erased as though their very existence had been a stain, and so debt became eternal. A curse carried by the living whispered about the dead, haunting entire villages for generations. You could lose your land, your freedom, your family, even your grave. But debt, that never died. And this was only the beginning, because debt in medieval Europe wasn't just punishment. It was a weapon wielded by kings, lords, and even the church itself. Debt wasn't just misfortune, it was strategy. Debt wasn't just misfortune, it was strategy. Kings and lords used loans and fines like weapons. A farmer's unpaid tax meant his land could be seized. A noble's debt meant his loyalty was secured. And every missed payment fed the machine of power. England's tally sticks recorded not just taxes but chains. Each notch meant another year of bondage. Break the stick, and the crown still remembered. Debts written in wood outlived the debtor himself. Even nobles weren't spared. When lords borrowed heavily, kings waited for the inevitable default. Then, with contracts in hand, armies marched to collect. Land changed hands not by battle, but by ink and debt. And the church? It mastered the art. Indulgences, tithes, forced donations. All spiritual debts translated into financial ruin. Refused to pay, and your soul itself was held hostage. Heaven became collateral. But the most terrifying collectors weren't kings or priests. They were neighbors. Every town had its moneylender, often a man despised yet indispensable. His ink could rebuild your life or destroy it. One mark in his ledger, and the entire village knew your name carried debt like disease. Communities policed debt themselves, failed to pay, and neighbors turned executioners. Violence erupted not for crime or treason, but for missing a coin owed. Debt poisoned friendships, split families, and made betrayal routine. Debt also stripped dignity. In some towns, debtors served feasts for their creditors, chained at the wrist while pouring wine. Their humiliation wasn't just punishment, it was entertainment. And when all else failed, force arrived. Mercenaries burned fields, seized livestock, and dragged whole villages into bondage, all to satisfy unpaid balances. In medieval Europe, debt and warfare often wore the same armor. But what if you couldn't pay and neither could your children? Debts didn't vanish. They multiplied. Fathers signed contracts that named their children as collateral. A boy could be born already chained to obligations he never made. His first breath was already a debt he owed. Daughters became bargaining chips. Some were married off as repayment. Others sold into servitude. For many girls, their dowry wasn't a gift. It was a ransom paid to erase a father's mistake. Children were sold outright, auctioned beside animals. A boy's life reduced to a number, shouted in a crowded market. Debt erased not just wealth, but bloodlines. Even castles fell this way. Entire estates lost because one noble failed to pay. A fortress might stand for centuries, but collapse overnight under the invisible siege of debt. Large debts often ended in forced labor projects. Men dug canals, broke stone, or built cathedrals, not for pay, but as living repayments. Debt transformed free men into slaves wearing the mask of law. Some were trapped in endless cycles, turning mill wheels, hauling water, grinding grain. Labor that never ended, debt that never shrank. A lifetime of motion without progress. But the worst punishment wasn't loss of land, freedom, or dignity. It was loss of hope. Imagine watching your children grow from behind iron bars, year after year, knowing they would inherit the same shackles. The debt you couldn't pay today would be the chain around their necks tomorrow. And even in death, the debt wasn't erased. Preachers warned that unpaid debt tipped the scales of judgment. You could pay in silver during life or in fire after death. Tales spread of debtors returning as restless spirits, doomed to wander until their balance was settled. Villages spoke of ghostly figures scratching on doors, begging for coin they could never repay. For entire communities, debt became collective punishment. If one farmer defaulted, neighbors were forced to cover it. A single man's hunger became a whole village's ruin. Others were chained to galleys, forced to row ships until their bodies collapsed. Their debt paid with every stroke of the oar until the sea swallowed them whole. Debt in medieval Europe wasn't just money owed. It was a system designed to control bodies, families, even souls. And as the centuries passed, the punishments only grew darker. Because for some, debt didn't just mean prison or exile. It meant torture, pain so precise it rivaled the Inquisition itself. If you thought prison was the end, you were wrong. In medieval Europe, debt could unlock doors darker than death. Because for some, unpaid balances weren't just numbers, they were excuses for torture. Collectors demanded suffering as repayment. Iron chains cut deeper than debt itself. The weight of metal became a daily reminder. You owed, and pain was the currency. The rack wasn't reserved only for traitors. Some debtors were stretched until bone cracked. Each pull a question: where is the money? Who hides your silver? Suspension torture left men dangling for hours, their joints screaming, their pride shattered. The hourglass above wasn't measuring time, it was counting down the debtor's resistance. Others were forced onto iron spikes, compelled to stare at their own contracts. The message was clear: a signature could bleed you more than any sword. But sometimes the punishment wasn't about forcing repayment. It was about sending a message. Public humiliation was the cheapest punishment of all. Bound in the pillory, a debtor became spectacle. Children laughed, women spat, and neighbors hurled stones. Reputation died before the body followed. Some left with scars that never healed. Hot irons burned marks of shame into flesh. Brands that declared, forever this man could not pay. Others signed new contracts under torture, agreeing to even harsher terms. Shackled hands dragged ink across parchment, binding them to deeper ruin. Whipping stripped away more than skin. Each lash echoed through the streets, a warning to every villager watching. Debt wasn't just personal failure, it was a crime against order itself. The church could turn debt into damnation. Some were cursed in public, excommunicated, cut off from community, family, even burial. A spiritual death more feared than any chain. The unlucky were locked in cages, left hanging above gates. Days passed, food rotted, crows circled. The debtor's body became a warning sign no one could miss. But some punishments weren't about scarring flesh. They were designed to crush the mind. Confinement boxes shrank life to inches. Bent bones, shallow breath, endless darkness. This was debt distilled into despair. Others wore shame masks, iron faces shaped like donkeys or pigs, forced to walk the streets, mocked as beasts, their humanity auctioned off for laughter. Sometimes the cruelest torture was proximity. Debtors were shown the coins they could never pay, made to kneel before wealth that would never be theirs again. The wheel turned prisoners into parades of pain, rolled through the streets, battered by stones. Every turn of wood meant another turn of humiliation. Water became its own weapon, pouring, suffocating, endless, a medieval form of drowning, forcing the debtor to confess to debts that didn't exist. Even vermin joined the torment. Rats gnawed at ankles of shackled men. Guards watched with amusement, reminding all who saw the lowest creatures feasted on debtors first. Others were dragged through mud, contracts nailed to their chests. The crowd saw not a man, but a warning writ in flesh and parchment. Some were placed in iron maidens, not always pierced, but trapped, suffocated by the metal coffin. Fear itself became the payment. Courtrooms sealed these fates. A judge's word carried more weight than gold. And when he declared the debtor guilty, chains snapped shut. But what if chains and torture weren't enough? In some towns, debt itself became a death sentence. For some, the debt ledger ended at the gallows. Unpaid silver transformed into a death warrant. At dawn, debtors walked to the scaffold, where the axe was quicker than the collector's quill. Their crimes were written not on scrolls of treason, but contracts of credit. A tied parchment screamed louder than any confession. This man could not pay. Hanging was cheaper than prison and more permanent. Crowds gathered to watch lives cut short, not for murder, not for betrayal, but for the sin of owing coins. Others met fire. Flames swallowed men whose only crime was poverty, turning debt into ashes and their shame into smoke seen for miles. Behind every execution stood a courtroom, and behind the court, creditors whispered, their silver was gone, but blood could still be collected as spectacle. Families were dragged into the punishment too. A wife might watch her husband swing, children clutching her skirt. Debt didn't just kill a man, it scarred generations. In some towns, rivers collected more debtors than gold. Stones chained to ankles dragged them into silence. The current carried both bodies and warnings downstream. Others were forced to dig their own graves. Each shovel of dirt wasn't for gold, but for themselves. The last debt a debtor paid was to the earth. The sword was swifter than the scaffold. Nobles sometimes demanded beheadings for dramatic effect, turning debt into theatre, with blood for applause. Even in death, debtors weren't released. Bodies rotted in cages above gates, becoming carrion for crows. Travellers entering the city saw the warning: debts unpaid, lives unpaid. Some skulls ended up on spikes, parchments nailed to bone. Contracts transformed into epitaphs. The city skyline rose behind them, a civilization built on fear. Burial was denied to many. Corpses left in dungeons gnawed by rats were stripped of dignity. Death wasn't the end. It was humiliation eternal. Church doors closed against debtors. Families were turned away, coffins left outside, prayers denied. Spiritual death sealed what the scaffold began. Some executions were hidden, dragged into woods, killed in silence, their deaths recorded in no book. Forgotten in life, erased in death. Widows weren't spared. Courts forced them to inherit the shame, reading debts aloud even as the husband's body still swung from rope. Corpses were paraded as lessons. Horses dragged bodies through filth. The debt nailed to their chest, the shame nailed to memory. Rare but real, some debtors were crucified. Not for heresy, not for rebellion, but for unpaid silver. A punishment reserved for spectacle, resurrected to terrify. Mass executions of debtors cleared ledgers in one bloody stroke. The crowd counted corpses like tally marks, each body erasing one unpaid coin. Graves went unmarked, families forbidden to mourn. The silence was louder than any bell, the message clearer than any sermon. Poverty was treason. And so debt ended where justice began, at the rope, the fire, the sword. In medieval Europe, poverty was not weakness. It was a death sentence. But what if your family still lived after you died? In medieval Europe, your debt didn't end with your last breath. It hunted your bloodline. Death freed no one. When a debtor swung from the rope, the noose slipped around his widow's neck, figuratively. Courts declared her responsible. The parchment nailed to the door didn't fade with his last breath. The seal of the creditor dripped like blood. A widow could inherit her husband's house or his shame, but never both. The debt came first, the home second, her dignity last. Children carried debts like collars. A father's unpaid coin became a child's burden. No matter how small their hands, parchment could weigh more than chains. Homes were stripped bare. A family's cradle carried away by the same hands that once brought bread. Soldiers shoved them into the street, where every stone echoed with the word debtor. Even churches turned away debtors' families. Widows with infants at their breast knelt at the threshold, but priests shut heavy doors. To forgive debt was seen as to forgive sin. Doors were painted with red symbols, marks that cursed entire families. Neighbors crossed the street. Friendship was another debt no one dared pay. When families collapsed under the weight, children were sold or abandoned. Orphanages overflowed, not with war's children, but with debt's children. Some families became slaves to the very men who had loaned their father's coin, forging chains for others while bound by invisible ones of debt. Debts were locked in chests, but they unlocked suffering for decades. A widow could beg for mercy, but a sealed document had no ears. Fields, oxen, seed, all stripped. A family that once planted wheat now harvested shame. No soil was left for them to till but the mud of the roadside. In some cruel records, children were branded, not criminals, not thieves, but marked for the debts of their blood. Their skin became parchment, their pain the signature. Most wandered. Families turned into shadows, walking roads that never welcomed them. Every tavern whispered debtors' kin. Every storm seemed gentler than human judgment. Wedding rings bought bread, but creditors swallowed even love's last symbol. A widow's ring, meant to bind two souls, became payment for chains she never forged. Some sons were taken as soldiers, coinless payment for fathers' debts. Sent to wars not their own, they bled, so creditors could balance their ledgers. Daughters were sold like grain. Their price scribbled onto parchment, their futures erased with a quill. Debt had no gender, it devoured all. While families starved, creditors feasted. Gold coins clinked in goblets as bones protruded from children's arms outside. Wealth sang inside. Hunger screamed outside. Some lived among the dead. Cemeteries became homes, tombs became tables. Children slept on graves, learning too young that death was a softer master than debt. Widows worked until blood stained the thread, candle after candle, night after night, weaving life back into ledgers that never ended. Orphans stood in snow clutching the papers that doomed them. Villages barred doors as if poverty were a disease that spread through touch. Some creditors ended the story in fire. Families watched homes turn to ash, debts erased not with payment, but with destruction. A final message written in flame. You cannot escape what you owe, but what if you manage to outlive your creditors? In medieval Europe, even the grave couldn't erase your debt, because it followed your descendants for centuries. Death was no escape. Even as coffins passed, creditors lurked in doorways. They bowed not to the dead, but to the parchment that bound the living. At the grave's edge, parchment lay heavier than soil. The ledger was placed upon the coffin, not as farewell, but as reminder. The debt still lived. Even priests joined the exchange. For enough coin, absolution could be bought, but never for the debtor. His soul rested uneasy, chained by promises, unpaid. As soil fell on the coffin, creditors turned to the widow. You inherit, they said, not just his name, but his chains. Family trees became ledgers. Births recorded beside debts, marriages calculated as alliances of coin. Generations were shackled by lines of ink. Grandchildren stood in court for sins never theirs. Judges declared, blood remembers. And the law agreed, coin owed by one became coin owed by all. Some creditors dug deeper, literally. Graves disturbed, rings stripped from skeletal fingers. Even death's silence could not guard treasure from debt's hunger. Monasteries held archives where debts outlived memory. Ink-stained monks copied ledgers that chained families for centuries. To them, sin and silver were one. Notices were nailed. To posts, unpaid debt now falls upon the heirs. Villages whispered names, and shame became inheritance more enduring than land. Descendants wore the crimes of ancestors. Some bore chains not for theft or violence, but for a number scratched centuries before they were born. Fields were lost for generations. Families ploughed soil they once owned, their labor feeding creditors' tables. Debt was an inheritance of hunger. Children counted not birthdays but debts. Each tally mark on the wall was not hope for the future, but reminder of what had already been stolen. For nobles, debt was an investment that grew across generations. What one man borrowed, his great-grandchildren repaid. Ledgers became family heirlooms for creditors. Tombstones bore invisible chains. At night, villagers whispered of graves that groaned. Debts unpaid, spirits restless, the dead pulled back to earth by parchment. The living were not alone. They walked alongside the ghosts of debtors, spirits that haunted streets ledger in hand, eternally unpaid. Even in cathedrals, debt was sanctified. Stained glass reflected holy light, but below, debtors prayed in chains. Salvation promised, but never granted. Crypts told the truth. Bones beside coins, skulls beside ledgers. Death was supposed to equalize, but even in the crypt, gold lay, heavier than flesh. Some fled. Families vanished into forests, burning their debt papers in secret. But ashes did not erase memory. The debt followed them in whispers. Centuries later, some debts still lived. In dusty 18th century courts, descendants were summoned to pay what ancestors borrowed in medieval markets. The graveyard held no peace. Fog rolled, coins clinked, and shadows whispered the same cruel truth. In medieval Europe, death ended life, but never debt. And this was only one chain. Next time, what if the debt was not silver, but blood? What if you had to survive the Mongol invasions? Tell me in the comments, would you have lasted even a single day? Subscribe to Nightmare.
Historians, because the next debt is always deadlier.